water was pouring in, vines were growing in through the windows, animals were getting in there. They knew that if they didn't do something quickly, that it probably would be lost forever. Meanwhile, I'm on the other side of the Atlantic, searching for something else, bigger and, I guess, a meaning in life in a way. And I think it's that perfect storm of us both searching for an answer that brought us together.
His name is Hopwood DePree. In the midlife crisis, you can always take up marathoning or buy a motorcycle, but Hopwood decided to go big, 50,000 square feet big, when he set his sights on a disintegrating manor house in England and a new meaning in life. This wasn't any old disintegrating British manor house. There are more than one. This structure, Hopwood Hall, shared his name. He tells about it in a new memoir, Downton Shabby, one American's ultimate DIY adventure, restoring his family's English castle. I'm Mark S. Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Hopwood DePree was perhaps the unlikeliest of candidates for a job like this. First off, he was an American, family roots in the Midwest, obsessed with cameras and cinema, smitten with all things Hollywood and California. By age 18, he was studying film at USC, and as soon as he graduated, decided he'd try to break into the industry. He scraped together his savings and maxed out credit cards to direct and star in the documentary, Rhino Skin, The Making of a Movie Star. So here's what was up with that movie. It's one of those classic stories of somebody trying to break into the movie and TV industry. He had his cameraman follow him around as he tried for a year to get, in his words, just one line of dialogue on a network sitcom. But the real foot in the door turned out to be the documentary itself. His youthful determination making it paid off. It was picked up by film festivals, and he was soon jetting around the world from Hawaii to Australia to Europe, promoting it. At the time of Rhino Skin's release, a critic at Variety magazine wrote that Hopwood's willingness to share his rejections and failures manages to turn humiliation into a badge of honor and a very amusing film. Hopwood would continue to work in L.A. as an actor, director, producer for a couple of decades, his initial optimism and grit paying off well, and he was loving life in Southern California.
Having left Holland, Michigan as a teenager and moving out to sunny Los Angeles, it was a dream come true. It was palm trees and beaches and that sort of casual, laid-back attitude. The business day didn't really start until later, 10 o'clock, because when people would start making phone calls. I loved the lifestyle and I embraced it. For many years, I almost felt like I was in this holding pattern, probably from about the time I was 18 until I was 40. And I was really lucky and really blessed that my family remained somewhat constant. It didn't feel like we were aging in a way. Of course, I knew we were, but it felt we were very close and nothing rocked the boat too much. And then there was the death of my grandfather, which really shook me up. And then a few years later, it was followed by the death of my father. And both of those, they were two very important figures in my life, and both had a love of history. And I think that changed me. It really, so many people who experience death of a loved one. I mean, it changes your trajectory in life and your perception of yourself and everything.
Hopwood got his name from that grandfather who'd passed away, his mother's father. It's a name he did not appreciate in his school days, so he went by Todd, T-O-D, his father's initials. I mean, he loved his grandfather, but that name. When I was a kid, and if somebody started, a 70, 80-year-old man started talking to me about his family history, I would have called him an old fogey. Would you characterize your grandfather?
I think if I'd called him an old fogey, I would have been in trouble for a few weeks. He always had a love of history and genealogy and the stories of the family in England and also in Hopwood, Pennsylvania, where they had landed when they came over originally from England. And I really didn't have any interest in history or genealogy or anything like that. It kind of almost went the opposite because my grandfather was such a fan of it, and my parents too. My mother they loved it. And I think, like most kids, you're kind of want to do something different from what your family's doing or your parents are doing. At least I did.
Would you sit there and have your eyes glaze over sometimes?
Definitely, because I really was embarrassed of the name Hopwood. And I really didn't want anything to do with it. It was so different than any other name of any of my friends or any of the other neighborhood kids in Holland, Michigan.
Did you go to your parents and say, I want to be called Todd?
My dad had kind of seen that coming. It wasn't from his side of the family. I think he thought the name was unique and fun, but also unusual. And so he insisted that they include his initials as sort of a out for me, which I was so thankful for that. But my mom and my grandfather loved the name Hopwood. And so when I got to kindergarten, it didn't go over well with the other kids. My first day, I remember crying, being made so much fun of. And so then I just said, I'm going with Todd 100%. And that was it. So I didn't really even think of the name again. I kept it hidden from all my friends. My best friends in high school didn't know Hopwood. They didn't know it.
Back to your grandfather and the story of the castle and your family vacations too. I mean, your whole family seemed to care to talk about the past, and you were looking towards the future.
That's exactly right. I couldn't understand what their fascination was with the past. And any vacation we took always had some sort of educational component to it, which of course as a child, I didn't like. And when a lot of my friends were going to the beach or going camping or going to an amusement park, and we were traipsing around the U.S. looking at presidential homes and libraries and things like that, following the Freedom Trail on the East Coast. But it was a really unique upbringing. I'm so thankful for it now.
So I'm trying to imagine this grandfather of yours, and I'm wondering if when he talked about the castle, was he speaking from knowledge or hearsay? Was this just kind of the family lore and legend?
This was passed down for generations about this Hopwood Castle to him, even as a boy. So he knew about it, but there wasn't much information out there. This is before the internet. This is before, you really had to do digging, and there wasn't a lot there. A lot of it did feel like legend, family lore. It felt very much like stories or bedtime stories. It didn't feel rooted in believability for me as a child.
Yeah, so if you're an American in those days and you're hearing about palaces and castles, you may have heard about Windsor, you may have heard about Buckingham Palace, but nobody's going to say anything about there's a real Hopwood Hall.
Yes, yeah, and it didn't seem real, and I always just thought if it did exist, it would have been gone hundreds of years ago. I didn't think it would still be there.
It was, and still is, having mostly survived a 600-year history. We're talking about a 2-story stone and red brick edifice situated just outside of Manchester, England, with battlements on the roof, 60 rooms, Jacobean lattice windows by the dozen, with their diamond-shaped panes of glass glistening like jewels. Oh, there's more. Elaborate interior paneling of oak with ornate plaster moldings on the ceilings, about 30 chimneys, vestiges of a kitchen garden, an Italian garden and fountain, a cornmill, an ice house, a moat, scattered woods on the periphery. You get the idea of its former splendor. Recent years saw the addition of a razor wire security fence surrounding the whole to ward off vandals.
This building started as a typical medieval manor house where the lord of the manor would sit on a raised dais, his servants would sit lower down. There probably would have been a fire in the middle of the room with the smoke exiting through the ceiling. So that was the basic one back in the 1400s. That was improved by adding to it in every direction and also adding a floor to give an extra room above the main hall.
That's Geoff Wellens, a local historian of Hopwood Hall. He's very quick to put the place into perspective for us Americans, such as here when he was describing for me the ornate oak carvings, which had recently been dated through tree rings.
And they can definitely say that tree was cut down in 1426. By the way, how old is America? Can you just remind me?
At the zenith of its existence, Hopwood Hall was a bustling institution, employing a village for all its operations, from maintaining the physical plant to keeping its occupants fed and clothed. Here's Bob Wall with a story that demonstrates how a manor house could almost be an entire economy unto itself. Bob Wall is the modern caretaker for the hall and has years of experience as a historical and heritage building specialist.
4 o'clock one morning, a little boy goes into Lady Hopwood's bedroom, shakes the fire up, relights the fire, so when Mrs. Hopwood wakes up at 7:30, that the room will be warm. So he tidies up and leaves the room. 3 hours later, her lady's maid comes in. "Good morning, Mrs. Hopwood. What would you like for breakfast?" And she said, "Oh, a slice of toast." 2 years prior to that, her woodsman had chopped the tree down, given it to the charcoal maker, who made it into charcoal, to give it to the blacksmith, who made the plough, to go behind the horse that was in the stables, so he had to go to the stable man, and then there was a leather man that made the leather, and a timber man to make the timber of the plough, to plough the field, to sow the wheat. The farmer then tended the wheat for the 9 months it was in the ground, cut the wheat with a scythe, because again, nothing mechanical, took it to the watermill that they had on site to grind into flour, to give to the baker that they had on site to bake it, who then gave it to the cook to slice it, toast it, hand it to the lady's maid, who would then take it to Mrs. Hopwood, who then said, "Oh, that's very nice, but I wanted butter on it." So we've got the same, we've got the cows, we've got the milk, we've got the milkmaid, and then before you know it, for a simple slice of toast, there's about 15 to 20 people. And they might all be individuals to you and I, but they all had families, and they all had wives, and they all had children. So on site, because we've talked about blacksmiths, we've talked about leather workers, we've talked about stables, we've talked about horses, stable boys, milkmaids. And then she turns around and says, "That's very nice, but I wanted honey." So I want to start expanding on it. Just for one slice of toast for the lady of the house, you've got 30 people, and they had to light the fires first. And she had her own coal mines on site. And if she wanted a soft drink, she had an ice house on site. And that was just for one simple slice of toast. So you imagine if it was a large meal. So when you look at it like that, you think of how many people have walked the same corridors that I've been very fortunate to walk, and the people that they've touched. And Downton Abbey gives this kind of air of, oh, everything's honky-dory in the big house. The majority of the people and the staff that worked in the big house were unpaid. You would have heard people say, "Oh, my daughter works at the big house." "Oh, very good. Yeah, she works 18 hours a day, 6.5 days a week. Doesn't get paid, but she's got a roof over her head, and she gets 4 meals a day and a uniform." And it's only when, the higher echelons, like your under butler and your butler, die off that everyone moves up, so it's the original dead man's shoes.
But the hall no longer had that village looking after it. The last heirs to the hall had been killed in World War I, and the devastated family survivors had moved away. It sat empty for decades until it was used by a company that made military uniforms during World War II, was later in the care of the De La Salle Order of Monks. They turned it into a teacher's college, and if you can believe this, these monks put in a bar and a disco as well. But for the past few decades, it's been vacant again and in the care of the local municipal council. Vandals and the weather were leading to its ruination.
Hopwood Hall was deteriorating before our very eyes. Dry rot, wet rot, rotten floorboards, the polish taken off all the oak panelling. It looked awful. And most of that was simply down to people stealing the lead off the roof. The lead flashings, really, those are things that the bridge over where the tiles finish and the walls begin, or where the top of the roof or the valleys between one apex and another apex, those are critical because they take the raw water away from the tiles and the roof generally to the gutters. Once that lead has gone, the rain just pours right through, literally right through the building, through the first floor down to the ground floor, down to the cellar. And it can only cause structural damage, and it did do.
In case you hadn't heard, it rains in Britain. Back in L.A., Hopwood DePree knew only his family's oral tradition that such a place ever existed or that it was still standing, if it ever really did. People like Geoff Wellens and Bob Wall, they knew it was still a thing, or at least hadn't collapsed quite yet. But with the death of Hopwood's father and grandfather, the custodians of stories told by their American branch of the family, a sense began to build inside him, a sense he'd never felt before. Part duty, part curiosity, maybe even a sense of incomplete personal identity. And he starts thinking like this around 2013. He was about 40 years old.
I think I was poking around, looking through genealogy because I was curious, but I wasn't sure that I was going to find anything as exciting or life-changing as Hopwood Hall. So I was just looking. But when I saw this photograph of Hopwood Hall, it was like a light clicked on. It wasn't just the photograph. It really was a whole lot of emotion and sort of that aha moment that came flooding back to me because my grandfather had talked about it. And I never really believed it, or I never really took it to heart that it was a true place. That when that happened, I think it really hit me. Wow, he was telling the truth, and he was trying to pass something on to me that maybe I just wasn't listening or I was brushing off. It really was kind of rocked my world there. Just finding something on the internet, it really changed me, where I was in an absolute state of disbelief. And I knew it in some ways it was going to change some course of my life, but I never imagined this much would finding that photograph change my life this much as it has. And my perception of myself and the world and everything that I'm doing now. I mean, it really was a bit of a shock, but a welcome shock and an exciting one too.
Can you even imagine what your grandfather would have done if he had seen that photograph?
I think he probably would have felt the same way as I did because he hadn't seen it. He had only been told the stories that had been passed down to him. So he probably would have been just as blown away. But I do feel like he would be here with me today, encouraging me. He would have been the first one to say, let's go see it. You know, he would have been the first one to dig into the history. It is a very nice feeling in looking through all of the discoveries we're finding at the Hall to feel like he's with me on this journey, and even all the people before him. And it's been eye-opening, and I don't feel like what I'm doing, I don't feel like it's just for me. I feel like it's everybody, not only who came before me, but also who comes after me. You know, I feel like there's this, I didn't want to be the Hopwood who happens to be on this earth at this time, who has a chance to save the Hall, to be the one that didn't do it.
Ringing in my ears is a sentence you just said. You said, let's go see it. That trip, you still didn't, it was still just kind of a touristy thing when you decided to go see it. I mean, a little bit more than a touristy thing because you got the family connection, but there's still no hint of where this is going to lead.
Not at all. It was really just curiosity of going to see Hopwood Hall. And we were timing it with a journey that was going to be a farewell to my father. After my father passed away, it was unexpected. Even though he was 75, it just shook our whole family. And it took us a few years before we could really say goodbye and have that healing. And I think one of the things that he had said to me the night before he died was that he had wanted to go to the beaches of Normandy in France. And he died the next day, and that had always stuck with me. And so we decided to make a family trip over there to say our farewell to him. And I guess the closure also seemed important to my grandfather, who had died just before him, a few years before my father. And it seemed like, you know, while we're over there, why don't we